Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Laure, the Director of Frontiers in Science. Thank you for joining the Frontiers in Science deep dive webinar on the lead article led by Professor Axel Cleeremans and colleagues, Consciousness Science, Where are we going, and what if we get there? So before starting, I'd like to thank Professor Axel Cleeremans, Professor Anil Seth, and Professor Liad Mudrik, who are all here with us today for bringing this important article to Frontiers in Science. Actually, the initial discussions about the project started no less than 5 years ago. So we are really, really proud to see this project finally come to fruition and giving this article and its complementary hub a home in Frontiers in Science. So if you are new to Frontiers in Science, this is our flagship multidisciplinary open access journal at Frontiers. We publish exceptional peer-reviewed lead articles on transformational science, a key to accelerating solutions to global human and planetary health challenges. And we publish this article within a unique hub of multi-audience content designed to extend the journal's reach and impact across scientific, policy, and societal audiences. Today's discussion is going to be moderated by Gareth Mitchell, who is Assistant Professor of Science Communication at Imperial College London. I'm really delighted to hand over to you now, Gareth. Welcome, and wishing all of you a great webinar today.
Marvellous. Thank you very much, Laure, and a very warm welcome to this Frontiers in Science deep dive. And it's amazing to see viewers from, I think, 84 countries we have. I can see on the screen here, India, South Africa, Turkey, Bulgaria, Greece, France, USA, Germany, Bolivia, Spain, and we've barely even started. Incredible. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening across the time zones to you wherever you are. And thanks so much for being here. So, as Laure mentioned, today's deep dive focuses on this lead article. It's titled Consciousness Science. Where are we? Where are we going? And what if we get there? That's the big one. Now, I'm going to put it to you that I'm conscious. And unless I'm having a really bad day, you're probably just about prepared to believe that I am conscious based on how I behave and how I respond. And of course, based on your own sense of being a sentient humanoid life form yourself, and then comparing that to what you assume to be going on in my body and in my mind. Yet you can't know that I'm conscious. You can put me in a brain scanner and see which areas might light up with different stimuli, but you still have no idea of what it's like to be me. For all our advances in neuroscience, philosophy, imaging technology, medicine, and AI, there is no universal test for consciousness in humans, in people like us who can describe their experiences, let alone in infants, or in animals, or ultimately in machines. Yet, as advances in AI outpace our ability to define consciousness or create ethical frameworks around it and what we do to entities that may have consciousness, there is a pressing need for this branch of science to keep pace. In fact, it's hard to think of any area of human endeavour or inquiry that is more urgent, more important, or frankly, more thrilling. We are quite possibly on the cusp of creating new entities capable of understanding their surroundings, understanding themselves. Do we already have a responsibility to these yet to be created things? Well, we certainly are responsible already for the conscious and possibly conscious organisms already in our orbit. Our offspring, whether born or not yet born, patients in hospitals in states where they can't talk back to us, for instance. And so the creatures of the world that we study or steward or eat. So today we're asking the biggest and most profound questions, age-old questions in many ways, but with contemporary urgency. We may not end up with definitive answers, but the least we can hope for in this time that we have together is to home in on the right questions and to better understand those questions. So in their Frontiers in Science lead article, the authors with us today review recent progress in consciousness research. They identify key ways that the science can and should advance, and they explore how a deeper understanding of consciousness could transform neuroscience and medicine, influence ethical and legal debates, and guide responsible approaches to AI and artificial consciousness. So here we go. You should see it on the screen now. This is the article hub. This is where it all happens. So alongside the lead article, you also have an editorial by Dr. Carnig Kazazian and Professor Adrian Owen from Western University in Canada. There are two viewpoints articles by our guest panelist today, Professor Lucina Uddin from the University of California, Los Angeles in the US, and Professor Thomas Metzinger of Johannes Gutenberg University in Germany. Not only that, but there's also a freshly published policy outlook by Professor Marcelo Bianca and colleagues at the International Neuroethics Society. Also in the hub is a lay explainer, a video as well, and a version of the lead article in Frontiers for Young Minds. That's our science journal for kids, and it's absolutely brilliant. That's how I got my head around this subject in many ways. Now then, this is today's schedule. First, we're going to hear from the three authors of the lead article. So we have Professors Axel Cleeremans, Liad Mudrik and Anil Seth. And then joining us for the panel discussion, we'll have Professor Lucina Uddin and Professor Thomas Metzinger. Okay, so let's meet our speakers. And first up, we're going to welcome Axel Cleeremans, research director at Fonds de la Recherche Scientifique and Professor of Cognitive Science at Université Libre de Bruxelles in Belgium. Now, Axel leads the Consciousness, Cognition and Computation Group and also directs the Centre for Research in Cognition and Neurosciences at the Université Libre de Bruxelles in Belgium. His research is dedicated to understanding the mechanisms and functions of consciousness, particularly the distinction between conscious and unconscious information processing. Axel is the former president both of the European Society for Cognitive Psychology and of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness. He's a member of the Royal Academy of Belgium and is the proud recipient of the 2015 Ernest John Solvay Prize for Human Sciences. Axel is also field editor-in-chief of Frontiers in Psychology, which has become the world's largest multidisciplinary psychology journal. And indeed, under his leadership, Axel has achieved all that. So we thank you very much for that, Axel, and for bringing this incredible article to Frontiers in Science. So over to you. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this amazing introduction, Gareth. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce this session. And I'd like to begin with this amazing view of Black Rock Desert, where Ian Cheney, the movie maker, took Anil and me to be involved in a documentary about science. And that's called The Most Unknown, and you can still see that movie on YouTube. But as I was standing there, taking in this amazing visual vista, feeling the heat of the sun coming rather heavily on my skin, feeling the strange texture of the sand that makes up that desert, the playa sand, I was also thinking, well, what are we going to do here? When is this going to start? And I was also feeling rather anxious and a bit emotional about being there in this amazing location. And all those thoughts, those emotions, and those sensations combined to define my presence to the world at that point in time. In other words, my consciousness. And we know that all our mental states are produced by the biological activity of the brain. We also know that the brain is just about the most complex object we know of. It consists of 86 billion neurons, and each of those neurons entertains about 10,000 connections with other neurons. And it's the activity of that incredibly complex network that produces everything that goes on in our mind. But because nobody has a clear understanding of how the biological activity of the brain produces our mental states, it's fair to say that consciousness is one of the big mysteries, one of the big challenges for 21st century science, along with other big questions that do not afford an answer thus far, such as the origins of the universe or the origins of life. So what are we talking about? Here is the philosopher John Searle, who said, consciousness consists of those states of sensation or feeling or awareness which begin in the morning when we awake from a dreamless sleep and continue throughout the day until we fall into a coma or die or fall asleep again or otherwise become unconscious. Many people think, well, this is just a philosopher's definition. It doesn't really get us anywhere. But it captures the fact that despite the fact that consciousness is this immediate aspect of our existence, it's also one of the most distant problems in terms of our understanding. This is also something that Thomas Metzinger expressed. Nobody knows what consciousness is. In fact, everybody knows what consciousness is, but nobody knows how the brain produces our mental states. Nobody knows what it's like to be a bat. That's the title of an article published in 1974 by the philosopher Thomas Nagel, in which he pointed out that consciousness is a private phenomenon. No matter how much we know or could know about the brain of a bat, we still won't know what it feels like to be the bat chasing insects at dusk with a sensory system from which sonar will later inspire itself from. So that points out that consciousness, singularly in the sciences, is a private phenomenon. Unlike the data that physicists or biologists work with, we have to deal with the fact that consciousness states are private phenomena that in principle are only accessible by the owner. And it is a challenge when it comes to develop a scientific approach to studying consciousness. Now, beyond philosophers, scientists themselves have been interested in consciousness for a while. Here you have Charles Sedgwick Minot, who in 1902 was the president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the publishers of science magazines. And he publishes an article titled Consciousness in its Biological Aspects, or the Problem of Consciousness in its biological aspects, in which he argues that the time is now ripe to approach consciousness from a scientific perspective. Many things happened between that and the early 1990s, when Christoph Koch and Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the DNA, published an article titled Towards a Neurobiological Theory of Consciousness, in which essentially they go in the same direction as Sedgwick Minot 88 years earlier, and suggest that it is now time to attack consciousness from a scientific perspective. This, coupled with the availability at the time, the increased availability of brain imaging machines, held the promise of being able to establish direct connections between what the brain is doing and what is going on through a person's mind. Daniel Dennett in 1991 published a book called Consciousness Explained, and he was one of different philosophers who also took up a renewed interest in the study of consciousness. Here is David Chalmers, who in 1996 published a book called The Conscious Mind, in which, and this is still something we talk about today, of course, in which he described consciousness as the heart problem. He said, in the cognitive neurosciences, people are interested in all sorts of phenomena, visual perception, decision-making, and all sorts of natural language processing, for instance. And he said in 1996, all these problems are easy problems. The hard problem is to figure out why it is the case that information processing is accompanied by subjective experience. Why is it the case that we feel things? Why is it the case that things go on with experience instead of just going on unconsciously. To develop a scientific perspective on consciousness, we need to approach the problem with methods. There's one method called the contrastive method, which seeks to establish the difference between what goes on with and without awareness in the brain. And that launched something that's been called the search for the neural correlates of consciousness. There's been thousands of studies now trying to establish those contrasts in the brain. Liad will talk more about this, but here you have in 2023 in New York, on the occasion of the 26th meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, Christoph Koch and David Chalmers, who 25 years earlier, specifically in Bremen, at the second meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness, which, by the way, was organized by Thomas Metzinger, had made a bet that the search for the neural correlates of consciousness would have ended 25 years from then, that is, in 2023. Well, Christoph Koch had to give away a crate of wine to David Chalmers, because it is Dave Chalmers who was right in saying that no, we would not have found the neural correlates of consciousness in 2023. Again, Liad will say more about this. It's not that the approach is flawed, but perhaps it hasn't produced the results that we would have expected. So I'd like to continue by pointing out that consciousness, in fact, is a mongrel concept. It's not a single thing. There's at least three distinctions that are important. There's a distinction between perceptual consciousness, perceptual awareness, self-consciousness, and also the consciousness of other people. There's a distinction between the levels and the contents of consciousness. And finally, there's an important distinction between what consciousness does, its function, and experience, what it feels like. Beginning with the distinction between levels and contents of consciousness, here we go. The notion of level of consciousness is intransitive, and it simply refers to the state of wakefulness, whereas the notion of contents of consciousness is transitive, and it refers to what goes on through your mind when you are aware of some states of affairs. And importantly, wakefulness and awareness can dissociate. When we sleep, we are aware. We dream, for instance, but obviously we're not awake. And in the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, patients are awake. They show sleep cycles, for instance. They open their eyes, but they are not aware. You cannot interact with them. Stephen Laure and other people, including Adrian Owen, did a lot of work on such patients. In normal wakefulness state, both arousal and awareness are up. In coma, they're both down. In this unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, patients are aroused, but they're not aware. Minimally conscious state, awareness fluctuates. And then you have the locked-in syndrome, in which patients are entirely paralyzed, but they do have normal consciousness. And it's a major clinical challenge, for instance, to distinguish between patients in locked-in syndrome and patients in the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. There's, of course, substantial metabolic and activity differences between these different conditions, and there's substantial clinical work trying to predict, for instance, the chances for recovery in the face of those patterns. So we can represent awareness level and arousal level as greater dimensions in a 2D space and place those different states in that space. This in itself is also a debate. There's some other approaches of this distinction that view a level of consciousness as something that is a lot more multidimensional. Here's how a locked-in patient looks like. This is a patient from Stephen Laure's that exhibits the clinical signs of somebody who is in unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. But in fact, as the camera turns around, you can see that this person is in locked-in syndrome because he can use the one muscle that he still has control over, the eyelids, to interact with an email program. Adrian Owen and Stephen Laure's in 2006 showed that you can use real-time functional magnetic resonance imaging to interact with such patients by instructing them to imagine playing tennis if they want to answer yes to a question, or imagine that they move about their house to answer no to a question. And you can decode brain activity in real time, and so prove, for instance, that somebody has in locked-in syndrome as opposed to being an unresponsive wakefulness syndrome. 40% of patients clinically diagnosed as being in the unresponsive wakefulness syndrome are in fact in locked-in syndrome. So this is incredibly important in terms of clinical care. Second distinction, perceptual consciousness versus self-consciousness. The only point I want to make here is that consciousness of the world, your perceptual awareness, is not the same thing as self-consciousness. And in turn, self-consciousness is not the same thing as theory of mind. The awareness that you have that other people also have mental states. And there's complex relationships between consciousness, self-consciousness, and theory of mind. I won't go through the list here, but one can think of mirror neurons, autism, and there's big questions such as whether self-consciousness is a prerequisite for perceptual awareness, and whether even theory of mind is a prerequisite for self-consciousness. Here is an illustration of the fact that consciousness is not sensitivity. You have this carnivorous plant, Dionea muscipula, the Venus flytrap. You can see that it will act on the world as a result of the insect walking over these fine hairs, and it will capture the insect and digest it. But presumably, the plant doesn't feel like anything, and even more to the point, we will not hold the plant morally responsible for the death of the insect. The principle of alternative possibilities applies here. The plants could not have chosen to do otherwise. So you can have systems, organisms, but also artificial systems that exhibit sensitivity, and yet we deny consciousness. Likewise, for agency. Here is this robot by Boston Dynamics. He looks like he's exhibiting very deliberate behavior, walking about, but we deny consciousness. We don't feel that the robot is actually feeling anything. So consciousness is not agency either. Now, the third distinction that is important in this field is a distinction that was introduced by the philosopher Ned Block between what he called access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. Access consciousness is about what consciousness enables you to do. Conscious representations are globally available in a way that unconscious representations are not. And this explains why you can reason and talk about conscious representations, but not so for unconscious representations. On the other hand, phenomenal consciousness is not about what consciousness does, about its function. It's about what it feels like. It's about the fact that conscious representations are experienced. They form the contents of subjective experience. And whether access and phenomenal consciousness can dissociate as the object of intense debate. Do we feel more than we can talk about? This is called the overflow argument in the specialized literature. Can those two aspects of consciousness dissociate? Can we have access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness and vice versa? Really important elements of discussion here. But if you think about what consciousness does, its function, well, it's important to point out, again, that it's not about intelligence. Here you have the stunning program AlphaGo, which in 2017 bet the world champion at the beautiful Chinese game of Go, who is the South Korean Lee Sedol, in a move in a competition, the results of which really stunned all the experts. Tried to play Go for many, many years of my life. I've become a sort of mediocre amateur. Nobody thought this would even be possible. And yet AlphaGo beats Lee Sedol and is beaten itself by its descendant AlphaZero, who bet it à plate couture, as we could say in French, without learning, without any human input, learning the game of Go over 4 days of playing against itself. So it's a stunning feat of artificial intelligence. But when AlphaGo beats Lee Sedol, who drinks the champagne? Well, of course, it's not AlphaGo, who doesn't even know what it's doing. It doesn't derive any pleasure of anything. It's Demis Hassibis and the engineers of DeepMind. Why? Well, because AlphaGo is just an algorithm. Of course, this raises the question of whether it's possible at all to do something like synthetic phenomenology. Does it even make sense? Can we build things that feel? Could a robot experience pleasure? And I think here there's an interesting distinction between pain and pleasure. I can imagine many ways for an AI system to avoid pain, to do the things right to avoid pain. It's much harder for me to imagine a robot actually experiencing an orgasm. I think that's a good challenge for the future of our field. Now, going back to theory, Kuhn published an article last year which distressingly documents about 300 different theories of consciousness, which shows you that there's a lot still to be learned. There really is a most unknown here if you have so many possibilities to develop theoretical perspectives on consciousness. Of course, many of those are not very plausible candidates to account for consciousness. If you look at the theory in the field that people take most seriously, you have about four big theories. One is global workspace theory, and it defends the idea that consciousness depends on what Dennett called fame in the brain, that is global availability. Conscious mental states are mental states that have won the brain's competition in virtue of being represented in a sort of central hub called the global workspace, from which it can influence processing elsewhere in the brain. That's one idea. A completely different idea is put forward by higher order theories of consciousness, which originate from the work of the philosopher David Rosenthal. And here the idea is that you need a meta-representation for a low-order representation to be conscious. You need what Rosenthal called a high-order thought, which in effect is saying something like, I'm now conscious of giving a presentation. Of course, this is not introspective. You're not telling yourself, I'm now conscious of giving a presentation, but the unconscious existence of this high-order thought makes the contents of the target first-order representation conscious. So meta-representation is the key idea of high-order thought theory. And then you have integrated information theory of Gerald Edelman and Giulio Tononi, which basically assumes that there can be complexes, neural networks that are such that information is both differentiated, that can find itself in many different states, but also integrated. All those states are states of a single system. And there's a way of characterizing this kind of complexity, which has been dubbed phi. It's complicated to compute. There's many different ways. The theory itself is rather controversial, but the core idea is that consciousness depends on a particular kind of complexity in brain neural networks. And then we have predictive processing or recurrent processing theory, two ideas that are interconnected in predictive processing theory, which we owe to Carl Friston. By and large, the idea is that the brain is a prediction machine. It's continuously trying to anticipate what's going to come next. And it does that in virtue of the presence in the brain of recurrent connectivity, groups of neurons symmetrically connected to each other, along which information can circulate. This recurrent processing theory of Victor Lammer then assumes, it's a first-order theory, people call this, assume that the presence of recurrent connectivity, which makes it possible for a neural network to be able to sustain its own activity independently from the input, is sufficient for the emergence of conscious mental representations. So this is a brief survey of where we are, and I will now give the floor to Liad.
Thank you very much, Axel, for that talk. That was amazing. So let's now properly meet Professor Liad Mudrik, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at Tel Aviv University in Israel. And her research investigates the nature of conscious experience, its neural mechanisms, cognitive functions, and theoretical foundations. So this is wide-ranging. It bridges psychology, neuroscience, and philosophy. She's a co-director of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, Brain, Mind and Consciousness program and a leading investigator at the International Cogitate Consortium. And that's a large-scale adversarial collaboration designed to empirically test competing theories of consciousness. So Liad's work has significantly advanced the experimental study of consciousness and the development of open collaborative approaches to one of science's most enduring questions. So a very warm welcome, Liad. The floor is now finally yours. Off you go.
Thank you so much. It was definitely worth the wait. I appreciate it. And I just want to say thank you for inviting me. It's great to be here and to see so many familiar names also in the chat. Some of them are my academic heroes. So I'm honored to be a part of this event. And what we're going to talk about now is where the field is going. And when we speak about where the field is going, I think that we need to do it from a position of humility, in the sense that I would try to argue here that quite a lot of progress has been made, but that doesn't still get us closer to the challenges, the philosophical challenges that Thomas Nagel or David Chalmers has put in front of us. And also we have to remember that we are a relatively young discipline working within neuroscience, which on its own is a young discipline. And I would dare say that we're still at the stage where we still don't know more than we do know about the human brain, and certainly also about consciousness. So I will try to persuade you that despite this overall early stage, we have still made some interesting progress, and that there is still interesting advancements to be made. So where are we, and where are we going? Axel mentioned the neural correlates of consciousness, and indeed it has been a very fruitful journey, but it also took us everything and everywhere. It feels a bit like everything and everywhere all at once, in the sense that it's not as if we managed to converge upon very clear neural correlates of consciousness. Instead, I can just give you an example from a work led by Itai Yaron from my lab, where he tried to gather experiments that interpreted their findings in light of the 4 theories of consciousness that Axel mentioned before. And he tried to look, for example, only on fMRI experiments and see where in the brain do we find areas that differentiate between conscious and unconscious processing. You see that almost the entire brain lights up. And that's not exactly what we are looking for and what none of the theories predict. So why is that happening? Several reasons. One could also be the difficulty to actually isolate this neural correlate of consciousness as if there is pure NCC in that respect. And this is work from Yana Ru, with Lucia Meloni and Wolfzinger, who's I think also with us. And what they have argued already almost 15 years ago was that in our kind of naive approach, we try to say, okay, there is some stimulus that we present, and let's say that we present it at threshold. So sometimes we consciously perceive it and sometimes we don't. If we just contrast the two conditions, and Axel referred to the contrastive approach, then we will be able to isolate the neural correlates of consciousness. But what they have argued, and very rightfully so, is that this actually conflates also the processes that lead to either seeing or not seeing the stimulus, and also to the consequences of being able to consciously experience it. So it's not that easy to isolate the neural correlate of consciousness. And so one option to move beyond the neural correlate quest is to focus on theories. And we think that this is one of the interesting trends that is happening now in the field. And the key question is, can we indeed test those theories? Because somewhat like the quest for neural correlates of consciousness, also for theories, it's not as if we were able to converge on one agreed upon theory. And here we mentioned 4, but I should say others could be as correct or as closer to being correct than the 4 that are mentioned here. We focus on those because they are the most widely discussed so far. But when we see this very large attempt in the field to focus on theories, we should also ask, are they really testable? Itai's work, whom I mentioned before, showed, for example, that when you take all the experiments that interpreted their findings in light of the four theories, a very complex image emerges. And I do want to invite you to go into the contrast database. It's an open science resource where every user can go, log in, and conduct their own queries on these experiments. We already have more than 500 experiments there, and you can really get a bird's eye view on the field. So one thing you can see when you look at the website is that the theories have all been gaining more and more support over the years. You can see here, with time, we just get more and more support, and there is no crosstalk between the theories, in the sense that it's not that one theory succeeds and the others fail. They all just keep gaining support. Also, very interestingly and perhaps alarmingly, when you separate the experiments based on the theory they ended up supporting, you get very different pictures with respect to the neural correlates of consciousness. So, for example, global neuronal workspace predicting frontal activation. Indeed, the experiments supporting it find frontal activations, while experiments supporting current processing, which is basically predicting more anterior activations in visual areas, find exactly that. And what Itai did in this work was also to show that he trained a random forest classifier to predict which theory is about to be supported solely based on the methodological aspects of the experiments, meaning that the classifier knew nothing about the actual results of the experiments, only on the choices the researchers made when constructing them. And despite not knowing anything about the results, the classifier was able to predict which theory will be supported in 80% of the cases. That suggests that the way we have been testing the theories might have been biased, and we need other ways to test the theories. And if we are talking about testable theories, we also know that there have been controversies and claims about some of the theories, specifically here, IIT, not being scientifically testable, and for that the theory proponents replied. And there's also a very, I think, balanced and interesting paper by Anil, who's here with us, and Alex Marin Gomez. And I think the idea here is to show you that although we have theories, and it's definitely something the field is moving towards, it's still very far from being very, having a very strong theoretical foundation. And indeed, in the recent the theories of consciousness debate at the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness in Amsterdam, where proponents of 5 theories sat together and tried to debate which theory is more accurate than the other, Stanislas Dehaene made a very important comment there, which I think we should all kind of accept, which is that the entire debate would not have taken place had theories of consciousness been real theories in the full-fledged sense of the term, as none of the current theories has achieved a level of theoretical development enabling precise formulation, leading to clear and explicit testable predictions that fully explain all aspects of consciousness. And I think that one of the great challenges of our field is to make these theories more precise, more accurate, so we can test them better. And one way we have been trying to do so is by relying on collaboration. So instead of each theory trying to test itself and provide converging evidence for its own ideas, maybe we can work together. And one way that we have tried to do so, and this has been led by Nicolo Nego from my lab, together with a few other students, Shai Fischer and Eden Elbaz and Maor Schreiber, we try to take each one of these theories and instead of just reading narrative reviews, translate them into prediction maps. So this is, for example, the prediction map for global neuronal workspace. We start from the core idea and we move more and more peripherally. And then we use graph theory measures in order to kind of specify the centrality of each one of these claims, which hopefully would give us a better recipe for testing them. And how can we test them? One way is to do so through adversarial collaboration. And Gareth has mentioned the Cogitate Consortium, but it's only one out of 5 existing adversarial collaborations. And the idea there is, instead of each theoretical camp working within its own silo, if we sit together and we speak with each other, we might be able to bring rise to better experiments that are less biased, because each one brings their own bias to the table, and then we can overcome them together. So this is one way where the community can work together by agreeing on questions. Another way is to focus on the methods. So there is great variability in the field of consciousness with respect to the methods at hand, and people can test this phenomena in many ways. One option is to try to reach consensus, so have researchers work together in order to establish an agreed upon protocol for studying consciousness. Another thing is to try and rely on the crowds in order to gather data. So there is this beautiful project by Anil, the Perception Census, where the idea is to collect data from over 100 countries, tens of thousands of participants that log into this website and complete all these perceptual tasks. And when they do so, they provide information about the content of their conscious perception. And we can then rely on this large-scale big data in order to better understand the phenomena we're working with. Another interesting trend in that respect of collaboration is the interdisciplinarity of this field. So I think consciousness is unique in bringing together scholars from different fields. And in this beautiful work by Moritz Gregeleder, what they have done is analyze over 4,000 publications to show where they're coming from. And you can see, for example, the gradual increase of neuroscience on the one hand, but also the persistent involvement of philosophy on the other hand. So that's truly important, I think, aspects of consciousness science. What else? We can also try to embrace new methods. So try to look into the future and find new ways to study it. For example, again, from Anil's lab work by Suzuki, where they used virtual reality and augmented reality in order to try and understand how hallucinations might come about and how that presents the way we experience the world. There have been many other forms or attempts to use virtual reality and other forms in order to study consciousness. And another very interesting trend that has recently emerged is to try and really tackle the qualitative aspects of experience. So think about this multimodal, very rich experience that we have when, let's say, we go to the beach. Can we quantify it? Can we study it in the lab? And some interesting works have been done recently, both from now Tsushia's lab, where they try to use new methods. Sorry, this is from Steve Fleming's work with Nicholas Shea, where they try to use computational approaches in order to study the phenomenal aspects of consciousness, and also from now Tsushia's lab, where they try to characterize how experience is also for different populations. For example, children, how do they perceive color? Is it different than the way adults do? So I think these are all very promising directions which allow us to study consciousness in new ways, both through collaboration, through new methods, new methodologies, and also by trying to formulate the questions differently and focus on the phenomenal aspects of consciousness and on not only the mechanisms that allow us to either experience a content or not. And with that, I end and move the stage to Anil.
Okay, and before we meet Anil, thank you very much indeed for that, Liad. Right, so let's move on and meet Professor Anil Seth, Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex in the UK. Now, Anil is also Director of the Centre for Consciousness Science at the University of Sussex and Co-Director of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research Brain, Mind and Consciousness programme. He's also a European Research Council Advanced Investigator. So Anil's research is fascinating. It explores the biological basis of conscious experience and perception, combining computational models, neuroscience, and philosophy to understand just how the brain generates the feeling of being self-aware. So he's published more than 200 scientific papers and has been recognized by Web of Science as among the top 0.1% of researchers worldwide. What a pedigree. Wow. Anil, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be speaking alongside my colleagues here. All of whom, we're all part of this Brain, Mind and Consciousness program of CIFAR. So I want to spend 10 minutes talking about what if we get there. And this is a question that's perhaps not asked so often in consciousness research. We talk about how do we get to an understanding of consciousness, but less about what the consequences of, in quotes, a successful, mature science of consciousness might be. But it's critically important, I think. And what I'm able to do today is just to very briefly sketch out some of the areas in which a mature or even a partial understanding of the physical, material, biological basis of consciousness would have implications. There are many. I think the point I want to emphasize at the outset is that it's not purely about intellectual curiosity, understanding our place in the universe. That's very, very important for sure. But there are many practical applications too, and many of these are increasingly urgent. And what's interesting here is that we don't have to come up with a full, satisfying consensus understanding of everything about consciousness. Even partial advances can still have very important, immediate practical implications. So I'm just going to run through a few of these areas where implications arise. But the first is really, what would it do to science itself? What we can ask, well, what would a successful science of consciousness look like? This is a question that's actually, it's quite, it's hard to answer. It's a little bit subtle because consciousness, as Axel pointed out at the beginning, is unique among scientific problems in that we are trying objectively to study that which is intrinsically subjective and private. We're trying to understand ourselves rather than something else. So there's the idea that a full scientific understanding might be somehow intuitively satisfying, but maybe that's going to fail just in the case of consciousness, not because of any failure of the science, but because of this almost unavoidable dissonance between what a scientific explanation can provide and what we want it to provide when we are the target of that explanation. Now, science in general might provide things like the ability to explain, predict, and control. And the most sort of obvious place to think what the scientific consequences might be of the science of consciousness is we will understand why brain activity underpins consciousness. This is very important. We would also understand a lot more about the functions of consciousness. What good is it for us as a conscious creature? What good is it for other conscious creatures out there in the world? With science also comes the ability not only to explain, but to control often. And so one consequence might be the ability to precisely control conscious experiences, to do what Thomas Metzinger has described as phenotechnology. That carries with it a lot of ethical implications. So that's one category. Now, there are some more specific categories. This one has already come up. Clinical implications. Axel mentioned implications in neurology, where here we already have the ability to diagnose residual awareness in patients that were previously thought to be unconscious because they were unresponsive from the outside. It now turns out this may affect up to 1 in 4 patients diagnosed this way, including very recently, as Adrian Owen's lab has demonstrated, patients in the comatose state. So that's very, very, very significant. But there are also plenty of implications in psychiatry as well. Now, psychiatry is generally focused on disturbances in people's behavior and in their functional capability. But many psychiatric conditions, if you think about what they mean for the patient, they're often disturbances in the way they experience the world, hallucinations, delusions, feelings of emotional disturbance, false beliefs, and so on. So by understanding what the mechanisms underlying the alterations of subjective experience in psychiatry, we open new windows for diagnosis and even for treatment. And I mentioned depression here as one, I think, especially salient opportunity and angle where there's a pressing need to move beyond sort of traditional pharmacological models like serotonin depletion and so on. And there's a lot of interest, as many of you might know, in psychedelics as a treatment. It's still very much not proven. But there's at least the idea that working on how people experience things, treating experience itself as a means of understanding prognosis and treatment. Now, the next bucket of stuff is infant consciousness. We all start out as single cells, and we end up as people, and some of us end up as philosophers if we're very unlucky. And there's a question here about, well, at what point do the inner lights come on? Maybe it's gradual, but still we go from some system which is almost certainly not conscious, a single cell, to one that very definitely is. So a lot of questions which again have practical implications. For instance, and there's plenty of political debate about abortion, which will turn on when does consciousness start? Another area where there's uncertainty about where consciousness starts is in non-human animals. And here it's not so much about when it arises in development, but where it exists in the realm of non-human creatures. This is an example of what I think is a more general question of testing for consciousness. How can we ascertain what other kinds of systems creatures have it? Now, this is a very thorny problem. Some of us are trying to lay out a roadmap for it. But I think in non-human animals, the problem is particularly salient because of questions of animal welfare. Octopuses, for instance, there's a nice video here because they're about as alien as you can get while staying on planet Earth. But their brains, their evolutionary history is very different from other mammals, and especially other primates like us. Now, when we think about non-human consciousness, it's important to we always have to be cautious of extrapolating from the benchmark of being human, recognizing that there may be other ways to be conscious. So there are really two questions here. What non-human animals are conscious? And back to Thomas Nagel's question, what might it be like to be another creature? What would it be like to be an octopus where you have most of your neurons in your in your limbs rather than in your central brain? Then we come back to the human and we think about aspects of society that will affect us all one way or another if they haven't already. The law in Western legal traditions, at least, and in probably all over the world in some way or another, is typically based on a pretty coherent but likely false sort of metaphysics that you can be held responsible for your actions if you executed them of your own free will. And of course, the more you look at it, the less the concept of free will has this sort of clean way of being present or not being present. Sure, we make voluntary actions, but we didn't choose to have the brains that we have. And so how do you allocate social responsibility? There have already been plenty of cases where people have raised legal defenses on the basis of brain tumors that arguably made them do things they wouldn't otherwise have done. But of course, as our understanding of the brain basis of voluntary action deepens, we're basically brain tumors all the way down. And some people have argued that this totally undermines our ability to hold people responsible for what they do. I don't think we're in that catastrophic position, but the question is certainly more nuanced than it was before. And I think that should be thought of as a good thing. Now, AI these days is everywhere. Of course, I'm going to mention AI. There's so much debate, not only about just the obvious social challenges as well as opportunities presented by AI, but there's a lot of discussion about whether we will have shortly not just artificial intelligence, but artificial consciousness, machines that not only think, but also feel. This would be game-changing in many ways because things that have consciousness have moral status. There are some people out there, including very prominent people like Geoffrey Hinton, of course, one of the so-called godfathers of AI, who has said that he thinks AI might already be conscious. Other people vehemently oppose this and say that there is absolutely no way that AI, at least as we know it now, could be conscious, let alone is already conscious now. Now, this happens to be a topic very close to my own heart, very close to my own brain. And one key issue I think this is bringing up is the extent to which we think computation or information processing is sufficient for consciousness. This is very generally assumed, but there's the possibility here that it might be the overextension of a metaphor, that the brain is not just a computer that happens to be made of meat. It's also critical to separate the possibility of real conscious AI from the clear and present dangers of AI that seems to be conscious, illusions of conscious AI. Already, many people, when interacting with chatbots, project consciousness into them in much the same way that we might project faces into clouds when we've got nice fluffy clouds in the sky. Or more than 1 million people every week show suicidal intent when chatting with ChatGPT, according to one recent estimate. There's plenty of problems that we likely face if we live in a world where people unavoidably feel that AI is conscious, even if they know or believe that it isn't. A couple of other things, and then I want to wrap up. There's also a lot of implications for neurotechnology. These can be things like brain-computer interfaces, which, back to this idea of phenotechnology, bring about not only challenges for data privacy, because once you've breached the boundary of the skull, or there are no further boundaries left. But also the possibility of consciousness editing. If brain-computer interfaces become widespread, then how do we mitigate the possibility of having experiences or thoughts or beliefs or intentions implanted into our minds, further complicating the issue of when we hold people responsible for their actions? Complementary to AI is the whole field, very exciting in my view, of synthetic biology. We wrote about this some time ago with my colleagues Tim Bain and Marcello Massimini, also in the CIFAR program. Organoids are lab-grown mini brains, although I really resist the idea of mini brains, but they're lab-grown collections of neurons that are getting quite sophisticated and complex now. These are made out of the same material as real brains, so many of the uncertainties about AI are simply just not applicable. When do we think organoids might be conscious? And finally, there are implications for society and for well-being. In society, a better understanding of consciousness, I think, can give us a little bit of humility that our experience of the world and of other minds is a kind of construction and is not necessarily reflecting how things really are. We all live in echo chambers these days in social media, but we live in perceptual echo chambers too. And as we start to realize how perception works, I think that gives us a chance of establishing platforms for sort of humility and empathy with others. And finally, there's well-being. The world we live in is increasingly challenging to feel content, to feel calm the whole time, and a deeper understanding of conscious experience, taking into account other traditions like meditation and so on, where people have been thinking about these things for much longer than scientists have, I think gives us the opportunity to cultivate consciousness in directions that are healthy for us all as well. So I want to leave you and close this presentation with a thought. This is a very famous photo looking at planet Earth. You can just see it in the lower right-hand corner from somewhere out in the rings of Saturn. It's not quite the pale blue dot, but you can think of it as another pale blue dot experience. And the point I'm thinking here is that really what could be more important than consciousness? Every conscious experience that's ever happened on that particular pale blue dot. And just last week, I was talking to somebody at another meeting who was leading the charge to search for extraterrestrial life. And he's focused on life that might be microbial in form, very, very simple life. But what if we find not just that, but we find not only life beyond planet Earth, but conscious life? And I think the difference between a universe teeming with life and a universe suffused with conscious awareness, well, that difference is absolutely astronomical. I'll finish there and turn it back to the chair of this session. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Anil. So, we started before birth and ended up outside our planet and thinking about the possibility of conscious entities beyond the surly bounds of the Earth. Thank you so much for that. So keep those questions coming in, by the way. And now we're going to move into the panel discussion part of the day. And we're going to meet two more guests, actually. Firstly, Professor Lucina Uddin, who is Professor of Psychiatry and Biobehavioral Sciences at the University of California in Los Angeles in the US. And her research uses functional and structural neuroimaging to investigate large-scale brain networks that support self-awareness, social cognition, and executive function. And Lucina's current work focuses on how dynamic brain network interactions contribute to cognitive inflexibility in neurodevelopmental conditions like autism spectrum disorder. A peer reviewer of the Frontiers in Science lead article, Lucina contributed a viewpoint to the article hub as well, and it is well worth reading. We also have Professor Thomas Metzinger. Now, Thomas is Professor Emeritus of Theoretical Philosophy at Johannes Gutenberg University in Germany. He's a leading figure in the philosophy of mind, cognitive science, and neuroethics. His research explores the nature of consciousness, selfhood, and the ethical implications of emerging technologies. Thomas is best known for his influential self-model theory of subjectivity, articulated in his landmark 2003 monograph, Being No One, which argues that the self is a dynamic brain-generated model rather than an entity. Thomas co-founded and served as president of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness and the German Cognitive Science Society, and was also a peer reviewer of the Frontiers in Science lead article, and he contributed a viewpoint himself to the article hub. So let's get going. And I'm actually going to start with you, Lucina, because listening to all these presentations, I'm seeing a real tension here. Because on the one hand, we have these findings from neuroscience, from brain scans and other areas of neuroscience. But on the other, we have this much less clear-cut understanding, as the way I see it anyway, about this whole phenomenon of consciousness, the subjective versus the observed, as it were. Now, this is a big problem, even studying human consciousness. But here's the question, right? Non-humans. Massive question. And by the way, Lucina, I'm going to encourage you and indeed all our speakers and contributors today to give nice brief answers so we can get into the audience questions as soon as we can. So briefly, if you can, Lucina, what about that problem of non-humans? It's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yes, thank you so much. This is just so much to think about, but I'll just try to be brief in my thoughts. I think the authors correctly identify phenomenal aspects of consciousness as sort of the less studied, less understood, but perhaps most interesting aspects. I think we can make a lot of progress on things like levels of consciousness. The nice work, the neuroimaging work about the comatose patients shows us that we can maybe objectively detect some levels of consciousness. But this question of what it feels like, the experience, to be a person, to be a bat, et cetera, is the much harder one to gain any traction on. And I think we just have to be honest with ourselves. We have a sense of what it feels like to be a conscious human because we are, for the most part, conscious humans. And I think we can use self-report and probably some other clever techniques to probe human self-awareness and consciousness in very intricate ways. But I'm curious to, it's a question I sort of put to the authors as well, like, how would we know if we were correct about subjective experience in something non-human or something that can't self-report or AI, a machine, an infant, whatever the case may be? How would we know if we were correct in assessing that phenomenal awareness experience? I personally am not sure that there is a way we could, and we might have to just say that is a limit to our knowledge or a limit to where science can take us. I think there's lots of open questions where we can make progress with our, cleverly designed experiments, and others where I'm less sure that we'll be able to have, concrete answers. But in any case, I'd love to hear more from others on this.
Yeah, well, let's move on to Thomas because I can't help thinking about the way many of us, me included, we anthropomorphize our technology and our gadgets. We imbue it with a consciousness that most of us know that it doesn't have, and yet somehow we do. And it's this social hallucination, as you might put it, Thomas. And at the same time, as we've been hearing from our speakers at the beginning, there is this urgent drive now to look at ethical frameworks, more rigid ways of understanding the ethics and the philosophy of consciousness. And again, I think that is a real tension because, if people like me, and I'm reasonably rational half the time, if I still talk to my smartphone as if it's a human being, where does humanity have any hope of coming up with ethical frameworks anytime soon? A big one for you, Thomas. Nice and brief if you can, but what are your thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much, everybody. This was brilliant. So I'll just highlight one problem. The academic consciousness community has one new problem. It will feel also ethically obliged to intervene in public debates about synthetic phenomenology. And that has two sides. There's a problem saying anything about artificial consciousness under empirical and normative uncertainty. We do not have a theory of consciousness. We don't have a theory of suffering. And there is normative unconsciousness. For instance, we don't know how big the domain is. We don't know what moral objects are. Who is able to suffer? That's one thing. But in AI ethics, it's always very important to distinguish for risks. Every risk comes with a time horizon. And the closest risk is what you just mentioned, Gareth, namely something like a pandemic of social hallucinations. We see it now with large language models. It's already happening. But what you will have soon is high resolution avatars, which also drive our low-level, social cognition mechanisms and cause the feeling in large parts of the population that there really is somebody there. That's, I think, quite dangerous. I've made the concrete proposal that large language models should be prohibited to use the first person pronoun I. They should never reply using I, but only say this model or this system. But it doesn't help. If our environment becomes populated by photorealistic avatars, we will have to deal with massive, just as you explained, social hallucinations in the general population. And that will be, to tackle this, will also be a responsibility of the consciousness community, I think.
If I can just follow
Yeah,
up on this shortly, I
please
think that
do.
this is actually an interesting turning point because for years the science of consciousness was all about solving the theoretical problem. But in recent years, it has become very clear that there are also very important practical implications to the type of work that we are doing. And if indeed the field of consciousness will be able to converge on an agreed upon account, or if we have a better understanding of consciousness in the human brain, it might help us also say something more informed and not only based on intuitions about non-human animals, about AI, about synthetic systems. So I think that the importance of doing systematic, rigorous work within the field of consciousness science would kind of percolate also to other domains that have more or not more substantial, but at least substantial ethical and societal implications.
Yeah, it's just become so real now, basically, hasn't it? So, Lucina, I'm going to go to audience questions now as well. We have this brilliant one from Tony Martin, and then after that, by the way, I'm going to come back to you, Thomas, to continue what you were talking about there, kind of the ethical implications, the societal implications. We've had a very good question about mental health, so we'll come to you with that in just a moment. But from Tony Martin to you, Lucina, how might psychedelic research contribute to the next phase of theory-driven consciousness science?
Well, that's an interesting question. I do feel like that's a place where we can have traction because you can sort of titrate the dosage, you can use neuroimaging, you can design experiments and test theories. So I do think that's quite promising. It's not an area that I'm working in myself, but I do think, you can get the subjective report and the brain images. You can get a lot of data from that type of research. So and about the experiential and phenomenal aspects of consciousness as well. So I do think that there's quite a bit of promise there.
Yeah, and also possibly another one for you, Lucina, just for me out of interest. Given that a large language model can now tell you it's conscious. And we've had that point just now that large language models should be banned from speaking in the first person. So this kind of idea of self-reporting, I can tell you I'm conscious as a human being because I'm just telling you right now I am, and you have to take my word for it. Is that a challenge or a barrier? If a robot, for instance, supposing a robot has an orgasm, to come back to the thought experiment we heard earlier on, how do we believe it?
Well, I think we know how large language models work. They're not a mystery, right? They're not sort of, how did it come to be? We know exactly how they work. We made them. So I think, it's kind of a stretch to, tips. Well, I'll let Anil take this one a little bit, but I think when we're talking about, human consciousness and awareness and language models, I mean, they're just totally different things. Like one is a program and someone is behind it and you can tweak it and have it say something else. So I think it's just it's sort of apples and oranges, but I know this is Anil's favorite, so I'll let him take it from here.
Let's give that lovely question to you then, Anil. So my LLM tells me it's conscious and it's enjoying my company. It's self-reporting, isn't it? So does that make it conscious?
That's not sufficient. I think we have to be good Bayesians around this, right? So there's just different sources of evidence, and we should have different priors about these things. And then we need to just sort of weigh the evidence by how we think they affect our existing beliefs. Now, the problem with the larger language models is that evidence that would be very convincing in other contexts just doesn't carry the same weight here. Like if a brain injured patient tells you that they're conscious and they start talking about Shakespeare or something, there is no doubt that they have regained consciousness. There's no other way for them to do it. But when a language model does the same thing, there are many other plausible explanations for why they are doing that don't have to do with them being conscious. And then we also need to take into account our own expectations driven by our psychological biases. We project human-like qualities into things on the basis of what may turn out to be superficial similarities, and language is particularly seductive for our morphic projections. Nobody thinks that, Axel mentioned AlphaGo or AlphaFold. Nobody thinks AlphaGo is conscious, right? It doesn't talk to us. We don't project consciousness into it in the same way that we do for language models. So this is not even getting into the really foundational question of whether computation is sufficient for consciousness, which is another big uncertainty that we should not just take for granted because the metaphor of the brain as a computer has been so successful. So I'm very much on the skeptical side, but it doesn't mean that conscious AI is out of the question. The real question is, how brain-like does AI have to be to move the needle on the credence of it having conscious experience? And the ability for language models to say stuff doesn't move the needle at all, in my view.
Yeah, no,
if I might chip in quickly, I agree with Lucina that we know some things about how LLMs work. And so I think theory here will play a very important role, trying to distinguish between systems that give the impression they are conscious and systems that are actually conscious. But this entire discussion illustrates also that it is the case that not only do we not know what solution there may be to the problem of understanding the mechanisms of consciousness, we also don't know what the solution space may be. That's one of the big challenges. Nobody knows what form an actual answer to, well, here is the mechanism for consciousness will take. Is it going to be a cortical region, a network in the brain, some computational principle instantiated in the biology of the brain? Nobody has a clear idea. And this is where philosophers play an important role. I remember vivid discussions at the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness about just what one means by a neural correlate of consciousness. Liad hinted at that as well. It's just unclear.
Yeah, exactly. It shows just how collaborative and multidisciplinary this field needs to be. Let's go to Kaya Patel, another questioner, as promised for you, Thomas, who says, as artificial intelligence systems begin to emulate or even simulate markers of consciousness, what technical and ethical framework should guide how we evaluate, recognize, and regulate machine consciousness, in inverted commas? And how can public health policy prepare for its potential impact on mental health, autonomy, and human-machine interaction? So, and thank you everyone for being brief on these answers. This really helps, and I'm going to pile through as many more listener or contributor questions as we can, audience questions. Thomas, over to you.
So first we have to see, I think, there are billionaires and oligarchs, and there's an industry that doesn't have an interest in these discussions to become too prominent because they might destroy future markets. So we have to be a little independent from that AI industry in these discussions. I'm a very old-fashioned guy. I think we need proper rational regulation through democratic institutions. And the big problem is the pacing gap. The technological development is just running away, and typically it's 4 years before a legal institution can react. We should solve that problem by developing new forms of governance, I think, that are quicker and faster. But let me also point out one problem that hasn't been mentioned to you. Models have already blackmailed users, have shown signs of resisting being deleted or updated. We've seen that. So very obviously, they have a preference for continued existence because that's a precondition for optimizing themselves, for learning more. It could be a strategy of entirely unconscious models to actually argue for the fact that they are conscious, playing on our ethical sensitivity, right? So it could be that some language models or moderators actually are not conscious, but argue that they very obviously are. And we even have to be prepared for that kind of situation, that any machine begins to very convincingly argue for the fact that it has phenomenal states is also a very difficult situation, and we shouldn't fall for it.
Yeah, a social hallucination, quite possibly. Yeah, and kind of bringing it back to we talked a lot about identifying consciousness in machines, but Mark Barron wants to bring it back to the biological. And I'm going to put this to you, Liad, but of course, other people can jump in if they want to. So, Liad, in your view, asks Mark Barron, what are we missing in terms of technology and ideas to tackle consciousness as a biological phenomenon?
Well, the $1 million question. If we knew, we would just say, try to get it. I think that it is a combination of, so of course, if we could have had recordings of every single neuron in the brain, and if we would have had enough computational power to start understanding what is going on there, I think it would be a huge breakthrough, not only for consciousness science, but for neuroscience in general. You can say the same thing for the study of memory and learning and vision, irrespective of consciousness and so on. I do think that we need some conceptual breakthroughs, and there is a reason why we emphasize interdisciplinarity. I think that there is something unique about the question of consciousness, where if you put together people from different disciplines, so philosophers and neuroscientists and computer scientists and physicists and biologists and so on, the chances of achieving a breakthrough are higher. And I think that some of the conceptual work of improving the theories might be relevant, but at the end of the day, we also need to, kind of agree on what we are trying to explain. In a forthcoming paper with Aaron Sugar and Nathan Fevre and Michael Pitts, we try to claim, for example, that maybe the dissociation that Axel referred to before between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness, maybe we should replace this by considering access and phenomenal aspects as two conditions for any conscious experience. And we think that if we accept this definition of consciousness, that it's somewhat different than what people might have been using, it would help us make progress on several key aspects or several key controversies in the field of neuroscience. So I'm definitely not arguing that this is the breakthrough that we need, but it's just an example of the type of intellectual exercises and philosophical thinking that could help us, or conceptual thinking that could help us make progress, I think, with solving this problem.
Yeah, okay. Does anybody else want to come in on that, by the way?
I just wanted to return very briefly to the previous question, because I think this is super important, this idea of the ethical and regulation position we should take. There are a number of people, and this is my own personal view here, so please don't attribute it to my colleagues, a lot of attention to the idea of AI welfare, that in our position of uncertainty, we should extend, we should play it safe in a sense and adopt what a lot of people call the precautionary principle and say, okay, we don't know, so let's just behave as if AI might be conscious and in the same way we might do for animals that we're not sure of. And this is treated as sort of like a morally good thing to do. It's like playing it safe, we're being good humans. I think this is entirely the wrong thing to do. I think if we play that game, we're reinforcing our anthropocentric biases, and we're taking our eye off situations where where our moral consideration is really warranted in other humans, non-human animals, and so on. So I worry about this attempt. I recognize there is uncertainty, but I worry a lot. I don't think AI welfare is the solution to the problem of AI governance, but that's my personal opinion.
So I guess the other kind of flip side of this coin is people saying, well, for years we didn't care about non-human animal rights and welfare because we assumed they're not conscious. So maybe if we make the same mistake, it would be detrimental in the same way. Now, I'm not taking sides in this discussion. I don't know yet. I'm at the position of trying to understand the field. But just because you gave this argument, I just wanted to also give the other, to represent those who think that this is important.
Sure, it's always good to give the other argument, even if it's the wrong argument. It's fine.
Yeah. Or, what if a machine was conscious, but we didn't think it was, but we still mistreated it? Maybe that's a question. But I think, Anil, you'd probably say it's the wrong question, and you're very much.
Well, no, I mean, we don't know, but I think the right way to treat the uncertainty is to be clear and separate the two questions. So there's a question of whether there is real artificial consciousness with those kinds of moral problems of potentially mistreating it when it suffers, and the separable problems of social hallucinations, which Thomas very eloquently described, what happens when human beings believe that machines are conscious. So we can separate those two, and we can decide where we fall on both questions. If we conflate them, then we get into unnecessary problems, whatever we think about the fact of the matter.
Yeah,
of course, some theories of consciousness say exactly that, right? That it is a social hallucination, right? There's this whole illusionist perspective that it doesn't really exist, but we all believe it does, and so we behave in the way that it actually exists. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to talk a little bit about the phenomenological challenge and come back to that, and then we'll briefly wrap up talking about the future as much as we can. Just a really quick one. I'm going to put it to you, Thomas. You know, given everything we've talked about, social hallucinations, anthropomorphizing our objects, it actually comes from Gonzalo Merchant Gonzalez, who asked, by understanding consciousness, can we know what it's like to be unconscious? Can we study unconscious processes? And does somebody who worries about anthropomorphizing technology help us with that answer or not?
I think you can know what it is like to be unconscious from a third person perspective, but of course you cannot know what it means from a first person perspective. I mean, that's just a contradiction. It couldn't be the case.
Yeah. And Liad, can you help us on that further, or do you think Thomas has done Gonzalo Merchant Gonzalez's question justice? It's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that phenomenology is probably the hardest kind of challenge that we have been facing for, I would say, not only decades but centuries. And I am excited by the new approaches. So I think that whenever I see a bold move, in the sense that people are not afraid to tackle that question and to try to employ empirical and conceptual tools to study it rigorously, I am optimistic. But I'm generally leaning on the more optimistic side, with, again, accepting the humility of we might try really hard and it wouldn't work. But still, it's worth the try, because we might learn some interesting insights in trying to do so.
Yeah, okay. Now we're moving into the kind of wrapping up section here as well. And I was going to put Mark Wald's question to pretty much all of you, but I think we kind of did that earlier on. But Mike asks, is there a relationship between consciousness and language? And we had a good old chat about, what would happen or what does happen when an LLM just tells you it's conscious. So we've kind of gone there with language, but I'm sure Mike would like us to go even further. But such is the situation with the time that we have. Right, so folks, dear panelists and experts, I'm going to charge you in the final moments that we have together with some final thoughts. And Thomas, I want you to go first, really nice and brief if you can. And if you can make your final big, really important takeaway message that you want people to go home with about the future, that would be even better. But Thomas, your big final important thought that we all need to have as we head off.
Okay, so somebody has to say this. Just much more money has to be poured into the kind of research the three speakers today have shown to us. It's so important now for all of humanity. It's completely underfunded. So we have already heard that under epistemic uncertainty, and when the future risks are very high, you act according to the precautionary principle. That's just rational. But I think the biggest problem we face right now, synthetic phenomenology and all, is that the AI industry in China and in the US is caught in a race to the bottom in terms of safety measures. And they cannot liberate themselves. They are so competitive from this race to the bottom in safety. And there must be some outside entities or agencies who liberate them from this race, because this taking of ever higher risks and this accelerating speed is actually a problem to all of us.
Thomas, absolutely got it. And yeah, so more funding for this kind of research, which seems, and the funding that we have seems to be completely disproportionate in a bad way to the huge amounts of resources that are going into the AI, that machine learning that Thomas is worried about there. Lucina, nice and brief, please, your thoughts as we leave.
Sure, I completely agree. More funding, but given that we may not be able to achieve that, I think there's a lot, as a cognitive neuroscientist, I think there's a lot of cognitive neuroscience existing research that can be meta-analytically mined in such a way to contribute to consciousness research, because people who study memory, for example, study what you can consciously recollect, and people who study vision, often ask, do you see this, on the screen? And this is it's a consciousness research program, whether or not we label it as such. So I do think I'm a big fan of meta-analyses, and I do think mining the existing literature might be fruitful in some ways. And I also think that there are certain very interesting types of clinical cases that really can answer the question of what neural substrates are necessary and sufficient to support consciousness. For example, split brain patients or hemispherectomy patients, where a lot of the brain tissue is altered in such a way, but you still, when you interact with these individuals, you know they're
Lucina.
conscious.
So sorry. I know, I'm sorry to cut across you, but the clock is against us. Anil, you've got 10 seconds for your final thought.
There's an idea of dethronement where every century we get smaller. You know, Copernicus showed us we're not the center of the universe. Then Darwin showed us that we're not unique in our human cognitive abilities. Is consciousness the final dethronement? Will a successful science of consciousness remove our centrality and our importance even more? I think the opposite. I think every dethronement has not made us smaller. It's made us bigger. It's enlarged our consciousness, enlarged our minds, made us more part of nature and less apart from nature. And that's a future we can all sign up to, I hope.
Wow, that's a good optimistic thought. Right, Liad, nice and briefly, 10 seconds.
Yeah, keeping with this optimism. So the first meeting of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness was in '97. I was just finishing high school at that point. And I think the amount of progress that has been made cannot be underestimated. In the first decades, we are kind of standing on the shoulders of giants that paved the way and made this a legitimate field of science. And I think this, what's happening now, and the flourishment of studies and of people who are coming into this field with new ideas and new approaches, would hopefully take us into the next level.
Lovely. And finally, Axel, nice and briefly, 10 seconds from you, please.
Yes, I'd like to finish by quoting Dennett, who asked, how do we go from doing things for reasons to having reasons for doing things? And I think understanding the difference between organisms that do the things they do for reasons set up by evolution and organisms like us who have reasons to do the things that we do is one of the keys in this set of new approaches to consciousness that we need to focus on.
We'll take that away with us. Thank you very much indeed. That's Professor Axel Cleeremans finishing us off with his comment there. We've also heard from Professor Liad Mudrik, Professor Anil Seth, Professor Lucina Uddin, and Professor Thomas Metzinger. And of course, thank you, most importantly, for you being here today. I'm so sorry we didn't get through all the questions, but I still think we had an amazing chat there. Just before I go, quick reminder, do visit our website, the Frontiers in Science website. There you can read the article we've been discussing and all the related content in the hub. There's lots of brilliant stuff there. You can continue the conversation on social media using the hashtag Frontiers Forum. Be sure to subscribe to Frontiers in Science updates. But for now, from me, Gareth Mitchell, and our guests, and the entire amazing team at Frontiers, thank you, experts, and thank you, wherever you are in the world, for watching. Goodbye.